Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world we live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. So we're continuing our podcast series today, The Empire, a 250-year American story. And in today's episode, we're continuing our look specifically at the American Revolution. Now, in the last episode, we looked at the crucible of Valley Forge and the pivotal decision for France to form an alliance with the Americans. So this effectively turned the fight into a world war in which the fighting in the American colonies became less prioritized. In fact, the fight for treasures in the Caribbean by the powers of Europe was far more important to them from an economic standpoint by this point in the game. So that caused the fighting to shift south in America. The British moved the bulk of their forces to the areas of the Carolinas where they could hold off the Americans, but also defend their valuable holdings in the Caribbean. So that movement triggered a lot of stuff. And one of the first things we'll look at in today's episode is the effect this had on the black slave population in the American southern colonies. So the story continues. We're going to go ahead and kick off today with this episode in the Empire, a 250-year American story here at the End of History.
This is the End of History.
Of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So as I pointed out in the last episode, the movement of the bulk of British forces to the southern colonies, it really put a new emphasis on the contradictory state of affairs in America. A fight for freedom while they maintained slavery. So this set the stage for another important front, militarily and ideologically, in the American Revolution. From the earliest days of the American Revolution, British officials understood that the colonies' greatest internal vulnerability was the institution they depended on most. It was slavery. The possibility that Britain might weaponize, might seize that opportunity, might seize that vulnerability and weaponize the enslaved population. Well, many Patriot leaders quietly called it the secret, and it haunted the revolutionary cause. And the British absolutely tried to exploit this. James Madison, the man who would eventually become the architect of the American Constitution, the new nation's fourth president, he wrote before the outbreak of the war regarding this secret. He said, "We shall fall like Achilles by the hand of one who knows the secret." In many counties of the southern states, black slaves actually outnumbered white slave owners by a margin of 3-1. The historian, one of the best historians on this period of American history, in my opinion, Joseph Ellis, he writes, "In fact, all the colonies south of the Potomac were vulnerable to slave insurrections driven by the same argument for human freedom that was being hurled at the British government as the rationale for American independence. And the southern colonies were the soft underbelly of the American resistance." So the first major move on this front by the British had actually come in 1775 when Virginia's royal governor, the representative of the crown of the British, Lord Dunmore, on behalf of the British, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved men who fled their Patriot masters and joined the British forces. Now, this move so threatened the southern colonies and the landholders there that it actually radicalized them against the British. Many landowners and slaveholders who might have been loyal to the British up to this point, well, they felt betrayed. They felt offended by Lord Dunmore's radical move. It was a bold, calculated strike, and Dunmore knew that enslaved people were not only more numerous, but deeply motivated. The promise of freedom was more compelling than any political pamphlet. Thousands fled plantations. Thousands of slaves fled plantations to reach British lines, forming the Ethiopian Regiment and serving as laborers, as scouts, soldiers. And similar offers followed in the Carolinas and Georgia, even in New York, as British commanders realized how destabilizing this tactic could be. Unfortunately for the British, and even more so for those runaway slaves, Dunmore's proclamation actually turned into a disaster. I'm going to quote again from Joseph Ellis's book, The Great Contradiction. He writes, "But stories in the Virginia press soon began to report hundreds of black bodies floating ashore, initially suggesting with apparent glee that Dunmore had decided to feed the sharks. In fact, the front edge of a widespread smallpox epidemic was hitting Virginia, and African Americans were more vulnerable to the disease, and Britons who had developed some semblance of immunity after several decades of exposure to the virus, which had never struck Africa. The consequences were catastrophic for Dunmore's refugees, who began dying at a faster rate than new arrivals could replace them. In order to isolate the infected runaways, Dunmore eventually decided to move his base to Gwynn's Island off the Virginia coast. But the disease outran his effort to control it. Within a matter of weeks, over half of this roughly 1,000 escaped slaves were dead and the other half dying. Dunmore was forced to leave them behind and sail towards the Chesapeake with his small remnant of healthy survivors. When Virginia militia and accompanying reporters arrived on Gwynn's Island, they witnessed a scene out of Dante's depiction of hell. Dead bodies were lying one atop another over an area 2 miles long. The pungent stench from the decaying corpses were still in the air, and the dying were crawling over the dead, crying for water. For obvious reasons, no American artist at the time saw fit to depict the scene, and no American director ever since has chosen to feature it in a film about the American Revolution. If one is looking for martyrs, however, the dead and dying African Americans were martyrs to their own compelling version of the cause, which gave them a new kind of meaning to Patrick Henry's famous phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." End of quote. So Patriot leaders feared this strategy of Britain weaponizing the slaves for several reasons. First, obviously it threatened the economic foundation of the southern colonies, where enslaved labor powered agriculture. It powered their wealth. Second, it risked widespread uprisings, something that the white colonists there had long dreaded. And third, it exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the American cause, a war for liberty fought by men who denied liberty to others. British proclamations forced that contradiction right out into the open. Most of all, Patriot leaders feared losing control. If enslaved people fled in large numbers, the social order of the South, it could collapse. And with that collapse would be the unity of the revolutionary movement. So the big question I have when I look at this part of the story, when I read about these stories, when I read about what's happening at Gwynn's Island and stuff like that, why did Americans not simply retaliate against the British with their own promise of freedom to the slaves? Yeah, it would have hurt economically in the South, but to be honest, those economies were already being devastated by the war. It seems like the obvious answer to all the questions, at least with 250 years of hindsight, if the Americans had simply offered to free all the slaves who fought with them and for their cause, well, they would have strengthened their army, they would have given integrity to the ideals that they were fighting for, and they would have removed the risk of uprisings among the slaves in the South. And the fact that this did not happen, to me, that's evidence of something really far more sinister at play. At least that's the way it seems. The sinister truth is that there's a reality to the claims of white supremacy in this worldview of these slaveholders at the time. They were fighting for freedom, and to fight alongside the freed slaves for that freedom, it would have done more damage to their view of reality than even rebelling against the king would do. Well, in the end, British promises of freedom were inconsistent and often tragic in their follow-through, but the fear they provoked was real, and it shaped revolutionary strategy, Southern politics, and the uneasy moral terrain of America's fight for independence. So as the American front of the war shifted to the southern states, Washington and the Congress found it more and more difficult to keep troops not only enlisted but even interested in the war at this point. Although the core of the Army was solidified at Valley Forge, much of the rest of America, the Americans spread out across 13 colonies, seldom imagined the fighting would go on for as long as it did. The continental currency tanked in value. That meant the pay promised to the soldiers was just about completely worthless. Washington himself complained that a wagon load of money could barely purchase a wagon load of desperately needed supplies for his soldiers. So fed up with going hungry, exposed to the element and failed promises of pay, a fifth of the Continental Army actually deserted by this time. Many soldiers saw their friends, their family, even enemies back home cashing in on the war and increasing in their prosperity, while those on the front lines, those paying the real costs, gained nothing in return. The historian Alan Taylor, he writes, soldiers seethed as they suffered while so many civilians prospered at home. The troops also felt neglected by many officers preoccupied with their own honor, perks, and comfort as gentlemen. After a day's march, when a regiment camped for the night, officers claimed beds in houses, leaving soldiers to sleep in stables or out in the cold, rain, and snow without tents. Private Joseph Plum Martin recalled, venting our spleen at our country and government, then at our officers, and then at ourselves for our imbecility, and staying there and starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us so they could enjoy themselves while we were keeping a cruel world from them. The British hoped to take advantage of this failing morale when they moved the bulk of their forces into the southern states. And it was believed that loyalist support was much stronger for the British in the Carolinas and in Georgia. In fact, it may have been at one point. It may have been stronger down there, but the British policy of freeing the slaves, well, that had changed all of that. So what followed after this point in the war was a grinding, often savage campaign defined by rapid maneuvers, devastating defeats, and the emergence of some of the war's most influential commanders. So the British opened the southern offensive with the capture of Savannah in December 1778. That was led by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, who quickly secured Georgia as a loyalist foothold. There was an attempted Franco-American counterattack in 1779, led by Benjamin Lincoln and the French admiral of the French Navy. It failed disastrously during the siege of Savannah, reinforcing British confidence that the South might actually be able to be subdued. The turning point came in May 1780 when the British general Sir Henry Clinton besieged and captured Charleston, taking thousands of Continental soldiers prisoner in the largest American surrender of the whole war. Clinton soon returned to New York, leaving command to Lord Charles Cornwallis, whose aggressive pursuit of rebels set the stage for the war's most chaotic phase. Cornwallis's forces crushed the Americans again at the Battle of Camden in August 1780, routing the army under Horatio Gates, whose reputation never recovered after this point. He'd been famous early in the war. Now he's just kind of ruined from this point on. But British success masked a deeper problem. The South itself was fracturing into civil war. Patriot and Loyalist militias clashed in a brutal backcountry fighting, and British reliance on Loyalist auxiliaries often inflamed local resentment. The tensions exploded at the Battle of Kings Mountain, October 1780, where frontier Patriot riflemen annihilated a Loyalist force under Major Patrick Ferguson. And this victory electrified Patriot morale and signaled that British control of the interior was far from secure. In early 1781, the Continental Army regained momentum under General Nathaniel Greene. Remember, we talked about him in the last episode. His strategic brilliance really reshaped the whole southern front of the war. As I already mentioned, Greene was one of the biggest surprises of the Revolutionary War. He was probably Washington's most capable general and able to execute his leader's command whenever called upon. Just about any time he was called upon, he could take care of business for George Washington. Greene avoided large-scale battles, instead wearing down Cornwallis's troops through a campaign of mobility and of selective engagement. His subordinate, Daniel Morgan, delivered a masterstroke at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1780, very famous battle for this front in the war. He used this devil envelopment tactic to destroy a key British settlement under the Banastre Tarleton. Greene then fought Cornwallis to a costly victory at the Guilford Courthouse, where British losses forced Cornwallis to abandon the Carolinas and march into Virginia. So this southern spiral ultimately trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. We're going to come back to that fight in a moment, but the southern strategy really ended up proving to be a terrible miscalculation by the British. Now, even as all of this was unfolding, the Western theater of the war presented an almost completely separate war. The Western theater of the American Revolutionary War unfolded far from the iconic battles of the East, but it was every bit as consequential. And often it was even more brutal. Stretching from the Appalachian frontier to the Mississippi River, the conflicts in the West were driven by competing visions for land, sovereignty, for survival. For Patriot leaders, the West represented both a strategic buffer and a future empire. For many Indian nations, it was a fight to defend their homelands against encroachment that had accelerated long before the revolution had even begun. Patriots fought in the West for several intertwined reasons. First, the Patriots thought that they sought to secure frontier settlements from raids conducted by British allied Indian nations, particularly the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and various nations of the Ohio Valley. Second, they aimed to break British influence among those nations. They believed that control of the interior would strengthen the new republic's bargaining position. So finally, one of the last reasons why this was so important, many frontier settlers and militia leaders saw the war as an opportunity to expand westward, an ambition that often clashed violently with these Native American tribes, these Native American nations. So the Western theater's most famous of the Patriot commanders was George Rogers Clark. He led these daring campaigns into the Illinois country. His 1778 to 79 battles really weakened British authority and bolstered American claims to the whole of the Northwest Territory. Clark's operations relied heavily on frontier militias accustomed to harsh conditions and irregular warfare, but they also contributed to these cycles of retaliation that devastated the Indian nations there where they fought. George Rogers Clark emerged as one of the most audacious, but also one of the most controversial Patriot commanders of the Revolutionary War's Western theater. He was born in Virginia, hardened on the frontier, and Clark understood the geography, the alliances, the brutal rhythms of backcountry warfare better than most Eastern leaders did. His victories crippled British influence in the region and strengthened American claims to that Northwest Territory during peace negotiations that would come later. But Clark's reputation was never defined solely by strategic brilliance. He was also known, and he was also feared, for his willingness to use overwhelming and often ruthless force. Frontier warfare blurred the line between military action and retribution, and Clark embraced tactics meant to intimidate both the British agents and the Indian nations that were allied with them. He authorized the destruction of villages, the destruction of crops and food stores, believing that breaking the capacity of these Indian nations to wage war was essential to securing the frontier. His 1780 expedition against the Shawnee towns, though strategically inconclusive, it reinforced his influence and his image as a commander who met violence with greater violence. So Clark's harshest critics, they accused him of excessive brutality, especially in the way he would treat Indian prisoners and his readiness to employ terror, nothing but terror, as a tool of war. He explicitly stated that excelling the Indians in brutality was the only way to defeat them. That was his philosophy. Supporters countered that he was responding to years of raids on frontier settlements and operating within the grim logic of backcountry conflict. The British had in fact encouraged this among the tribes that they made alliances with. And Clark wasn't the only Patriot leader who used this terror, used this brutality as an instrument of psychological warfare. This is again from Alan Taylor's book, American Revolutions, writing about the Western theater of the war. He writes, by 1782, the Western collapse of federal authority freed settlers to pursue genocidal goals. In March, David Williamson, an accomplished Indian killer, rallied Western Pennsylvania's militiamen to cross the Ohio River to invade Indian country. Unable to track down elusive enemies, the vigilantes instead seized Nedenhuten, I could be pronouncing that wrong, a peaceful Delaware village led by Moravian missionaries. Irvine reported that they had built a pretty town and made good improvements and lived for some years past quite in the style of Christian white people. Irvine promised them protection, and they sent crops to feed his garrison. But the Delaware chief, Buckingohelas, told the villagers, remember that this day I have warned you to be aware of such friends as these. I know the long knives, they are not to be trusted. At Nedenhuten, Williamson's militiamen interpreted the European kettles and clothing as damning proof that the villagers had raided settlements rather than as evidence of their Christian conversion and civility. The militiamen butchered 96 captives, 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children by smashing their skulls with wooden mallets before scalping them for trophies. The natives died while singing Christian hymns. The victors burned the entire village to consume the bodies of their victims. Although appalled by news of the massacre, Irvine had to keep quiet rather than outrage settlers. He explained, people who have had fathers, mothers, brothers, or children butchered tortured, and scalped by the savages, reasoned very differently on the subject of killing these Moravians. So atrocities were tragically common on all sides. Frontier warfare blurred the line between combatants and civilians, and raids often targeted villages, crops, non-combatants. And so in 1779, after a series of attacks on frontier settlements, Patriot militias launched punitive expeditions against now the Cherokee towns, destroying homes and food supplies and what became known as the Cherokee Campaign. So similar destruction in the Ohio Valley, where both Patriot and British Allied forces conducted raids by ambushes, by scalping, and by reprisals. All of this was unfolding in the Western theater of this war. If you're enjoying this podcast series on America's history, you're going to want to check out my book, Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics. If you've ever wondered how a person of faith should navigate today's chaotic political climate, this book lays it out. It's not about parties. It's not about taking sides. It's a biblically grounded book at how politics works and how believers can engage with it and sometimes even stand against it. Within the pages of this book, we explore everything from today's political moment, the history of the Christian right, and what meaningful biblical engagement can look like right now. The book is Politically Incorrect by me, J.B. Shreve. You can find the links at theendofhistory.net or head over to Amazon and add it to your cart this week. So as the war went on, a general sense of chaos and anarchy really seemed to be unleashed on the western frontier and across the South. The American Revolution was not only a struggle against imperial authority, it also became a vehicle for deep-rooted class tensions that had simmered in the colonies for decades. Beneath the soaring rhetoric of liberty and natural rights, many ordinary Americans saw the upheaval of the American Revolution as a chance to challenge local elites who had long dominated land, dominated credit, dominated political power. So the collapse of royal government created a vacuum. And into that space surged farmers, artisans, frontier settlers who used the revolutionary cause to really settle old scores, to reshape local hierarchies. In many towns, committees of safety and vigilance, nominally instruments of patriotic government, they became tool for redistributing influence. Men who had never held office suddenly found themselves empowered to accuse, to fine, to exile wealthier neighbors suspected of loyalism. Property seizures, especially of loyalist estates, offered both ideological justification and material reward for these guys. For some, the revolution was just an opportunity to acquire land, to acquire social standing, to acquire long-denied political voice and volume in their society. So violence often accompanied this leveling impulse, right? Tarring and feathering, forced oaths, mob intimidation targeted not only British officials, but also colonial aristocrats who had controlled courts, who had controlled trade and patronage. So the revolution's ideals, it actually did provide this moral cover for actions driven as much by resentment as by principle. So in this sense, the war became a crucible in which class antagonisms fused with political ideology. And that reshaped American society from the ground up, especially in the southern and western theaters, or the southern and western frontiers. And the longer the war stretched on, the more the chaos reigned. But Washington's philosophy and strategy for the war was actually proving true. All he and the Congress had to do was not lose the war. The British had to win the war. And that was proving much harder for them now that the contest had morphed into a world war. So as the French made more advances against British treasures in the Caribbean, the British forces were stretched pretty thin. In truth, both sides valued the colonies in the Caribbean far more than anything on the North American continent at that time. Sugarcane raised by slave labor enriched planters and merchants who transported sugar and rum to Europe. Taxes on slaves and sugar exports generated more revenue for the rival British and French empires than any other colonial trade. By capturing the sugar-rich lands there in the Caribbean, they both hoped, the British and the French, they both hoped to enhance their financial and naval strength while diminishing that of their enemies. Increasingly, the British were simply using the southern ports as launching areas for defense of their Caribbean holdings. An imperial official in Britain even declared the war has and ever must be determined in the West Indies. It was this context, along with a major British defeat in Yorktown, Virginia, that finally brought an end to the American Revolution. So the Battle of Yorktown, fought in early September 1781, it was the decisive naval clash that sealed the fate of the British General Charles Cornwallis and made the eventual American victory on land possible. The British goal was pretty straightforward: break the French naval blockade forming off the Virginia coast, reinforce or evacuate Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, and then finally reassert control over the Chesapeake. Without command of the sea, Cornwallis was dangerously exposed, but London believed the Royal Navy could always reestablish dominance when it was needed. So the missteps really began in this battle, in this theater. It really began with faulty intelligence. British commanders in New York underestimated the size and the speed of the French fleet under their French admiral, who had sailed from the Caribbean with over 24 ships of the line. And when the British finally dispatched Admiral Thomas Graves to the Chesapeake, his fleet was smaller, it was less coordinated, and it was plagued by unclear signaling. And Graves's rigid adherence to line-of-battle tactics caused confusion ultimately at the critical moment, and it prevented his ships from concentrating their fire effectively. And the resulting Battle of the Virginia Capes ended with the British fleet battered and forced to withdraw. That withdrawal left Cornwallis completely isolated. And so the Patriot cause took full advantage of this opening. George Washington, working in unprecedented coordination with the French commanders at this time, he recognized this naval superiority created a fleeting opportunity to finally trap Cornwallis. And so Washington and the French general, Rochambeau, they executed this rapid, deceptive march south from New York, convincing the British they intended to attack Manhattan while actually racing towards Virginia. And the French admiral's victory ensured the British reinforcements wouldn't interfere with this surprise attack. On land, key Patriot figures shaped the siege that followed. Washington provided overall command and strategic clarity, while Rochambeau contributed to seasoned European expertise in siege warfare. Marquis de Lafayette, who we looked at in the last episode, he was already shadowing Cornwallis with a mixed force of Continentals and militia, and he was helping to pin the British in place until the main army arrived. Engineers under Louis de Porter, they directed the construction of siege lines that steadily tightened the noose around Yorktown. So with Chesapeake sealed and Franco-American forces closing in, Cornwallis's position, it just became untenable. And his final hope, a breakout across the York River, was shattered by a sudden storm. October 19th, 1781, he had no other choice, but he surrendered. And the naval battle off Yorktown was thus the hinge of the entire campaign, a British failure of coordination and foresight exploited by Patriot leaders who understood the control of the seas could decide the war. That surrender at Yorktown, October 1781, it's often remembered as the end of the Revolutionary War. But at the time, no one knew it would be the decisive blow. Britain still held New York. They still held Charleston and Savannah, and the Navy remained powerful. But Yorktown, the British defeat at Yorktown, shattered the political will in London. News of Cornwallis's defeat triggered a wave of public outrage in London. The Parliament revolted. Lord North, the Prime Minister, his ministry collapsed in March 1782, replaced by a government more willing to negotiate peace. And still, the fighting didn't immediately stop. In the months after Yorktown, skirmishes and raids continued across the South, across the frontiers, and British forces in Charleston and Savannah launched foraging expeditions while Patriot militias harassed them relentlessly. In the West Indies, the global war between Britain and France raged on, influencing the peace negotiations. Even in the North, Washington maintained this vigilant army outside New York, unsure whether the British might attempt a renewed offensive. His discipline during this uncertain period prevented the fragile Continental Army from dissolving before peace was secured. It was Washington that did that. Diplomatically, the path to peace was even more complex. American commissioners Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, they negotiated in Paris while carefully balancing French interest with American ambition. As part of the alliance, the American alliance with France, the Americans had agreed to not negotiate a separate peace with Britain, but to do all things in conjunction with the French. All right? For the French, the greater power in this relationship at that point in time, of course, the idea was to move the new American nation into a subordinate position. The French basically just wanted to supplant, to weaken the British and gain everything they could from the Americans. Well, a guy like John Jay, he's suspicious of the French motives. And he pushed, contrary to their agreement with the French, he pushed for direct talks with Britain. And that was a move that ultimately secured a generous territorial concession from the British, even though it violated the American agreements with the French that would have made winning the war impossible without them. The British, eager to end a costly and unpopular war by this point, they agreed to recognize American independence and grant the new nation territory stretching to the Mississippi River. And the British war with the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch would continue, but the American front now was coming to a close. So for the Americans, peace couldn't come soon enough. Washington's strategy of holding the army together was just, all they had to do was not lose. That strategy was hanging by just a thread. Tensions among the soldiers and the officers were simmering. Pay was months overdue, and officers feared Congress would abandon them once peace was secured, once peace arrived. These anxieties culminated in what became known as the Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783. This was when disgruntled officers in the Patriot Army hinted at collective action against Congress. The Newburgh Conspiracy was one of the most dangerous internal crises of the Revolutionary era, a moment when the Continental Army, frustrated and unpaid, seemed on the brink of turning against the very government it had fought to create. Officers stationed at Newburgh, New York, they had gone months without pay. They feared Congress would disband the army without honoring long-promised pensions. Anonymous letters circulated, urging them to take decisive, possibly coercive action against Congress. Some officers even discussed marching on Philadelphia or refusing to disband. Now, what stopped this potential military coup, it wasn't force, but it was George Washington's moral authority, his instinct for the symbolic gesture. At a tense meeting, March 15, 1783, Washington, these are all the conspirators meeting together in this large hall. They're meeting together, and Washington unexpectedly entered the assembly hall, and he addressed the officers who were plotting in the coup directly. He acknowledged their suffering, but he warned that any attempt to intimidate Congress would betray the very principles of the revolution. And his speech alone steadied the room, but what followed really became legendary. Washington's giving this speech, and he pulls out a letter from a congressman. He's going to read to them, right? He's going to read to these conspirators, to these officers who have fought alongside and for him and with him. And he pulls out the letter, and he pauses. He fumbles for his spectacles. And Washington goes, "Gentlemen," and he says this real softly. He goes, "You must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." Now, this simple act shattered the officers' anger. Some of them began to actually cry when they're watching the founding father, the father of the country. They're seeing him weakened, and the age that he's demonstrated, that he's given to the American Revolution. The conspiracy collapses instantly. The reality of all that Washington himself, the father of the country, had sacrificed through the war, it came hitting home. Once again, it was Washington's character, Washington's presence, that held the nation together. George Washington, had preserved civilian control of the military and safeguarded the fragile new republic. The Treaty of Paris was signed September 3rd, 1783, and it formally ended the war. British troops evacuated New York that November. The revolution's final phase was less dramatic than Yorktown, but it was essential. It was a period of restraint, of diplomacy and political transition that ensured the military the victory would become a lasting independence rather than a fleeting triumph. Now, in the next episode, we're going to turn to what followed the final stages of the American Revolution. Independence was secured. The war was wrapping up, but the revolution is going to continue. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, most revolutions end very poorly because the chaos and violence overwhelms the original ideals. The American Revolution was not exempt from this violence and this chaos, but something happened along the way that held back the tide of destruction that usually envelops revolutions. And that something is the Constitution. Much more than a document, it brought order and stability to the revolution when it was needed the most. That and a whole lot more is coming in our next episodes in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspective of our times and our history that built these times.